Hello, YouTube and the internet. My name is Nathaniel Quinn, and I am a former Green Beret, a Special Forces officer, and I want to talk to you all about mental health. First and foremost, I'll preface this with saying that I am not a medical professional, I'm not a medical provider, I'm not a doctor. I am simply a patient and someone who has my own experiences with it. And my hope is that through sharing my own experiences and my own narrative and my story, I can help other people with their own journeys. And also by exposing what I did and what worked for me and what didn't work for me might help give other people ideas as far as what maybe would work for them. But I am not a medical expert in any way, shape, or form, and I am not going to pretend to be. So mental health is definitely something that we as the United States and even the world have made great progress in terms of normalizing. We are a lot more open about having discussions with it, about it, encouraging people to seek help, coming up with new ways to help people. All that said, I don't think anybody out there would dispute that it is still an issue. All you have to do is look around and see how many people we are losing to it, still too many. And even on the international stage, you see people like Simone Biles, who is an Olympic gymnast, excuse me, and she recused herself from one of her events, and it was because of her own mental health. And she definitely brought that conversation to the forefront. Somebody of such prominence and notoriety openly discussing their mental health and making a decision based off that definitely reinvigorated that conversation and made it another priority. But I want to continue adding to that conversation. And what I think is that there are some additional steps we could take. And so that is really the focus of not just this video, but all the future videos that I'm going to create. And they serve three purposes. And one is to kind of change the narrative of that conversation. And so first of all, that narrative surrounding mental health, so surrounding depression and anxiety principally, right? PTSD, often only discusses mental health when we either lose someone. So we're talking about, hey, there was a person who was suffering from depression or some other sort of mental health issue and they ended up killing themselves, unfortunately. Or when we are discussing typically medication or maybe certain treatment modalities. So, hey, we'll try cognitive behavioral therapy, or hey, try this medication for depression or to enhance your antidepressant, right? That is typically the conversation that we have. We don't very often talk about the positive stories. And that's not to say there are not people out there who are not talking about the positive stories. This is my previous example, Simone Biles, I would argue, is a very positive story, a very positive example, but that is not a very common occurrence, and it is not, I would argue, commonplace. It's not very public, those conversations that we're having, if we are having them, about the positive outcomes, the positive experiences, the stories and examples of people who can live with and continue to live with depression, who have lived with it successfully. And so without that positive side, all we have is the negative side. And what that can do is paint a very inaccurate but negative picture. And it sometimes can generate a negative feedback loop. And this is something that I personally dealt with when I first experienced depression back in 2021. I thought, because all I had ever heard about often was, oh, I've got depression. I've been diagnosed with depression. Oh, I'm screwed. I'm doomed. And I actually ended up using that same concept of being doomed to my advantage to help me later, and using humor to sort of diffuse the seriousness of the situation. But it can create a very depressing, oddly enough, outlook for a person experiencing depression, right? Hey, everybody who experiences depression ends up killing themselves, right? I remember applying for health insurance because we had just had our son, not necessarily related, but we had just had our son while I was going through the beginning stages of my depression, and so we applied for some additional health insurance in case something happened to my wife and I to take care of our child. Well, the health insurance denied me because I had very recently been diagnosed with depression. And so they were like, it's not a great investment, which did not instill a lot of confidence in me. I was like, well, great. These guys aren't going to give me any sort of help. Then why are they not willing to take a gamble or a financial investment on me? Because it, statistically speaking, was not a good look or not a good choice. So that definitely messed with my psyche a little bit. And so my first goal and my first hope with these videos is to change that narrative, to generate and show a positive story in the hopes that it will ultimately inspire other people to share their own positive stories. Because I know I'm not the only one. It's just a very sensitive subject, and I think in spite of the progress we've made socially, it's still very taboo, and people are afraid to talk about it. And I think that leads into my second point, which is I want to use the power of storytelling to help reduce the stigma and the shame. And you're going to hear me say the word shame a lot, again and again and again, because I think that is one of, if not the biggest issue surrounding mental health, at least for men, is this perceived internalized shame that we feel for having depression, for being depressed. And so I want to use that power of storytelling, to use my experiences to help other people realize that they don't need to be ashamed. There's nothing shameful about it, and that they're not alone. And then again, hopefully taking that a step further, inspire other people to share their own experiences, their own narrative, to where at a certain point, hopefully we'll have so many positive stories that will counterbalance that negative side of the narrative. And therefore reducing the shame, reducing the stigma. And I say reduce because I don't think you're ever truly going to get rid of it. But if we can significantly reduce it or otherwise disrupt that stigma and that shame, I think that would go a long way towards helping people. And the key to that is, again, my perspective is one of a patient, not a medical provider. And the reason why I think ultimately this is beneficial is because we typically see that the medical field, medical providers, not just in the military, but also in the civilian side for mental health, are overloaded, right? And I think the reason for that is too many patients, not enough providers. Okay, well, the way to fix that is either we need to create more providers or we need to decrease the number of patients. Well, creating providers takes time, and if you capitulate on the standards, then maybe you're not getting the most proficient provider possible. So then our option is decreasing the patients. Well, how do we decrease the patients? And I think when I looked at my own experience, and I said, well, I sat on this basically until it got to the point where I needed to go seek additional help. And I think that is the case with a lot of people. I think a lot of people, men in particular, when they start to experience the symptoms and signs of depression or anxiety disorder or something along those lines, they kind of sit on it and ignore it in hopes that it goes away, or they just don't want to admit it because of that aforementioned shame and stigma. And so it sits and it grows and it metastasizes until such a point that either A, we lose them, unfortunately, or B, ideally they go seek help from a provider. But the problem is if we have all these people waiting until it's catastrophic to go see a provider, well, the provider only has so much bandwidth. The provider can't see all the patients simultaneously. So then how do we triage those patients? How do we identify who's most severe and who's not? And so the issue becomes that, you have a batch of patients who are already in a dire need who are now having to wait their turn through no fault of anybody's really. There's just not enough providers and there's too many patients. So now they have to wait their turn to go get seen. And in that period of waiting, the problem gets even worse. And now potentially they have to go inpatient because they're suicidal. And now we're at the extreme case. So how do we decrease the burden on the providers? And so I thought, okay, well, if the only real way to decrease the burden on the providers is to decrease the number of patients. And in order to do that, maybe we need to empower people to address the issues and the challenges earlier before they get to the point where we've reached critical mass. I need to go see somebody. I have exceeded my individual capability as me, Nate Quinn, to address this. I now need a medical professional. And so how do we give the individual person the knowledge and the skills to address it on their own so that they hopefully can deal with it when it's a smaller problem so that it doesn't metastasize into something bigger, ultimately needing a provider. And so I want to try to help people get ahead of this as early as possible. And I think the best way to do that is to have these conversations, to be open about it and encourage people to come forward and say, hey, you know what? Yep, I've got this. Nate, the way he's describing the signs and the symptoms, like that sounds like me the other day or the other week. Or like, hey, okay, Nate tried this technique. I'm going to try that too. Let me see if that works. Now, okay, hey, you know what? I'm going to Google something else and see if that works too. But the ultimate goal is to help reduce the burden on the providers and to help people address the issues early on, ahead of time, right? And if you look at it from the perspective of a cut, right? If you get a cut, most people, they know, okay, hey, wash the cut, clean it with some soap and water, put a Band-Aid on it, wash, rinse, repeat, keep the Band-Aid clean, keep the wound from getting infected. You don't ever really need to go see a provider for a cut, right? Now, if the cut's big enough, now, deep enough, bleeding a lot, all right, different conversation. But generally speaking, most people have the knowledge and the tools necessary to treat themselves to where they can keep that from becoming a bigger issue. Now, if left unaddressed, that cut could get infected, it could get worse, and now maybe we're at the point where, hey, we need to go see a provider, right? To me, if you look at it the same way, like, hey, I want to help people treat that cut while it's a cut, before it gets infected and it turns into something else. And I think that analogy is key because it leads me to my third point about adjusting the conversation and facilitating a rebrand. So in the Army, we went from mental health to behavioral health, right? The reason I don't like behavioral health necessarily is because whatever the issue is, it may not actually have anything to do with your behavior, all right? And in my own example, in fact, that was a significant challenge because when I presented to the providers, I was very collected. I presented as calm, collected, fine, right? I was articulating signs and symptoms like, hey, this is what I feel, this is what's going through my mind right now. But outwardly, I was calm. Now, a lot of that was just by design from my job that I had developed a proficiency in. But it belied that, hey, internally, I am freaking out, man. Like, I'm losing my mind. I'm sleeping like absolute crap. I'm anxious all the time. I just look composed. I'm presenting composed, but I am not composed. And so that dawned on me that, well, describing this as a behavioral health thing isn't necessarily true because my behavior's fine. In fact, my lack of weird or odd behavior is making it harder for the providers to accurately diagnose me, right? And once I had that conversation with them, like, hey, like, I know I look calm, cool, and collected, but I am losing my shit. For fair warning, there will be swearing. More than likely, I will do my best not to, but 12 plus years in the Army, it's bound to slip out every once in a blue moon, and I apologize in advance. Not trying to offend anybody. Actually just trying to help people. So, didn't like behavioral health, and so then I started looking at it going, okay, well, maybe we just call it, like, what if we call it something else, right? Don't like mental health because it's got that stigma attached to it. Don't like behavioral health because it's not necessarily something that's behaviorally related, right? what about cognitive health or cognitive injuries? And then I started to look at my depression and my anxiety like any other wound set, right? Like a broken leg or a stress fracture. And I will come back to that stress fracture analogy a lot because that is one image that helped me identify what was going on, and it gave me a different perspective to look at it, right? And you might say, Nate, what does it matter? Like you're talking about the same thing. Well, exactly my point. I am still talking about the same issue. Like I'm talking about depression, but I am looking at it from the perspective of a stress fracture, right? A cognitive stress fracture, a cognitive injury versus a mental illness, right? Now, if you sit there and you say it, so you can go ahead and say it, sitting there on YouTube watching, either on your phone or on your laptop, say mental illness and then say stress fracture or cognitive injury and see which one of those elicits a more negative emotional response. And I'm going to wager that it's probably the mental illness one, not this cognitive injury or cognitive stress fracture. And so we all know, right, and the medical field would know, hey, we're talking about depression. But by deliberately choosing an alternate word to describe that, you're changing your perspective. And I think the efficacy of that, of shifting your perspective and how you look at that through word choice, the power of that cannot be overstated. And that is something that I learned through my journey, deliberately choosing certain words over others to describe certain things, describe how I was feeling. It changed my perspective, right? And I will get into those examples again as I go through my journey and explain what I went through and how I got there and why that reframing of perspective can be helpful. But yeah, so that's really the third reason of doing this, is to try to shift that narrative, right? Or I'm sorry, change that verbiage from, mental health to behavioral health to cognitive health. Cognitive injuries. Let's look at these like any other injury. Are you ashamed of catching the flu? Are you ashamed of breaking an arm? Probably not. So why then are you ashamed of being depressed or having depression? And these are questions that I asked myself, right? To me, it made no sense. Like, why am I ashamed of this? And again, it wasn't that anybody external to me was making me feel ashamed. Quite the opposite. In fact, a lot of people were very supportive. My close friend group, my family, when I finally told everybody what was going on, they're like, hey, we're here. If you need us, let us know how we can help. We love you. Thank you for telling us. But that was beneficial to me because it also helped kind of, all right, I don't have to be ashamed of this. Like nobody else is making a big deal out of this except for me. And everybody else is very supportive and they still love me. Like nobody's abandoning me. I'm not dealing with this by myself. And so that I think helped relieve a lot of stress of kind of sharing the load, so to speak, to my friends and my family, my wife, my parents. They all knew. And so everybody was trying to help and was trying to take care of me and make sure I was in a good spot. So that's the third reason. The final reason I want to try to help, again, and this goes back to ultimately decreasing the burden on the provider, is to help give people the ability to treat themselves, right? Now, hear me out. I know I said I'm not a medical provider now, and I'm not. But in the Army, we all got issued an individual first aid kit, right? It's a small little pouch full of various first aid tools. So you have some gauze pads, a tourniquet, maybe a nasopharyngeal in case you stop breathing, some chest seals, things typically to help you as an individual treat a bullet wound, right? So if me as Nate, I got shot, this little pouch that the Army gave me is supposed to help me treat that until such time as a actual trained medical provider, be that a medic or a physician, gets a hold of me and now they take over with their higher level of training and skill and access to resources, right? Or conversely, it would allow, if I got shot, it would allow my battle buddy to come over, use my first aid kit to treat me. Either way, it's intended to be at the individual level, right? Individual level treatment. Now, not only did the Army give us these little pouches, but they taught us how to use them. And they taught us what each wound looked like, right? Hey, this is a bullet wound. This is what it looks like. Here's how you treat it. Go practice it, right? Okay, cool. I now know if I get shot, this is what I need to do until one of my medics arrives and takes over. Or if one of my guys gets shot, I now know what I need to do so I can stabilize him until I can get a medic over there. And I wonder to myself why we didn't do the same thing for guys for cognitive injuries, right? Why didn't we issue guys a cognitive IFAC? And so I actually created, in conjunction with my therapist while I was still with third group, a cognitive IFAC. And I think the tricky part is getting people to buy into it and have that and see that as value instead of just blowing it off like Green Berets and soldiers writ large like to do. And I think a way to help facilitate that is getting a Green Beret up there and saying, hey, you know what? I've used these things. I've done these things. It saved my life. It's not bullshit. And we're telling you this stuff because we want to help make you more survivable, right? We want to increase your chances of living and make you more durable. So here I am, Green Beret, sitting up in front of the world, for better or worse, sharing my story, sharing my experiences in the hopes that it inspires, not just other Green Berets or military service members or first responders or anybody else in the medical community to get up and share their own experiences, but really anybody, right? These videos aren't just for those people, and they're not just for men, even though this perspective is from me as a male. It's for anybody that's going through this. And it's even for anybody that's not. Even if you are not experiencing these issues as I described them, these cognitive injuries, that's awesome. But I would imagine that you probably know somebody who is, or if you don't, you might. The day is still young. You never know what's going to happen tomorrow. You might run into somebody. It could be a friend. It could be a loved one. And you may say, hey, you know what? You were starting to sound a lot like this dude on YouTube. And I want you to watch his videos and just hear what he has to say and understand that, like, it's okay to be going through what you're going through. And maybe some of the stuff he's talking about, some of the things he does, maybe you could try some of that and see if it works. And if not, if all else fails, then maybe we need to go talk to somebody. Or maybe, and I'll come with you. So whether you yourself are experiencing these issues or somebody who is, I think there's a lot of value in what I'm trying to do. And I hope above everything else that this helps people, at least one person. So yeah, if you like what you've heard and you want to keep hearing more, then subscribe and keep watching. I'll be posting these, haven't really figured that part out yet, but maybe once a week. And I'll try to keep them relatively short, about 20 minutes a piece, so I don't put all you to sleep. I think I went over that this time, but appreciate y'all watching. And until next time, I'll see you then.